Hello, this is SGD. Back in 2018, I released a series of episodes on focusing on the Borobudur Temple in Indonesia, looking at the various aspects as in connecting architectural traditions, religious traditions, sacred number, measurement systems, and how they would connect to what's often referred to as the Pythagorean harmonics, music, uh, design traditions, again this sort of just in the general sphere of the esoteric, and how east to west, from still practice in modern times going back in ancient times, from Egypt, the Mesopotamia, the Roman period, Hindu, Buddhist architecture, and so on. So I just thought I'd put them all together into one single video rather than on a playlist, and also corrected a few points in there. But anyway, hope you enjoy some of the sort of content I used to make years ago, and again, just to put it into one single piece. Borobudur Temple in Indonesia. Hello SGD, Sacred Geometry Decoded, and try a bit quicker. The Vesica Pisces, Vesica Piscis, sacred geometry, and the sacred geometry of architecture, and how it connects between multiple cultures across a long time. And so looking at Borobudur in Indonesia, this very famous temple, and there's quite a bit to say about it, but I'll just be focusing on this particular part, where a survey conducted in 1971, I think it was, revealed multiple ratios of 4 to 6 and to 9 as well, indicating the architect used fractal or self-similar geometry in the design. So that emerges from the vesica, which leads to the flower of life and how these systems grow. Also the mandala, not to be confused with the mandorla, but the mandala is also this pattern built into not just Borobudur, but also Prambanan and Hindu, Buddhist temples as well. But this ratio of 4, 6, 9, and how does that connect? So here we see some of the cross sections, and we see the 4 to 6 to 9, and the 2 to 3, and the 9. Now 4 is, well, 4 to 6, sorry, is a 2 to 3 ratio, and 4, 6 and 9, well, 2 squared, and 9 is 3 squared as well. Now we'll be seeing this in many other places, but let's look at the Vesica Piscis, this Pisces, the 2 to 3 ratio inherent in there, which is important in music theory as well, but 2 to 3. So 4 to 6 is 2 to 3, and 6 to 9 is a 2 to 3 ratio. So you can see how the Vesica, whether that was the pattern or not, is not important, is that ancient architects across time, across the world, across cultures, always come back not just the same numbers, but also to the same ratios and proportions, which are then reflected in the measurement systems as well, which is a curious feature, because, well, if it was just if they just sort of knew these geometric ratios, okay, this can be developed independently, but that multiple cultures across time, across the world, always come back to the same number systems, and that's reflected not just in proportion but in the units of measure. That's very significant. That is really important and overlooked, because the standard view is that all the cultures developed independently. Only later period did they have influence, but for instance the Indus, China, Sumer, Mesopotamia and Egypt, that they all developed independently, and it just so happens to be pure coincidence that all the, not just the ratios, numbers in symbolism, but also the units of measure come back to these same set of numbers. But that's off on a rant. So just to begin with, a 2 to 3 ratio using the vesica, well, where you can see how the vesica aligned vertically as opposed to horizontally gives a 2 to 3 ratio. Now 3 squared is 9, we could look into that as well, so it's 2 to 3 ratio. But you see the same thing here. So if the foot of the temple is 4 and the body is 6, that's a 2 to 3 ratio. So once again, just twisting the vesica 90 degrees, you get this pattern happening. Now this is interesting because I've done plenty of videos in the past on this, so let's just skip over so many other temples, including megalith temples in France and the UK, and over to across the Mediterranean, over to, well, everywhere really, but the famous Parthenon. And this has a length to width ratio and a width to height ratio of 9:4. Well, what's 9:4? Well, 3 squared is 9 and 2 squared is 4. But also, there have been many studies on this. You can just look, well, this 9:4 ratio, well, throughout the temple, because from a 3:2 you can construct a 9:4 ratio, but the actual 2:3 ratio is the important part, the inherent part within there, and that can be found throughout the Parthenon as well. But this links several of the grandest pyramids in Egypt. For instance, the Red Pyramid, the base is at a 3:2 ratio to the height of the Great Pyramid, and the Pyramid of Khafre is at a 3:2 width to height ratio as well. So the pyramids and the Parthenon, which also incorporate all these other lovely proportions and these units of measure which come back to the same numbers as well, but it's still being practiced now, and especially through the modern esoteric Hermetic traditions, include, for instance, Manitoba Legislative Building in Winnipeg in Canada, the foundation stone laid on a very significant day, but also the width to the height of a building, 2:3, or the Hermetic constant as it's called. Frank Albo's done a lot of work on Winnipeg, but also here in Australia, Governor Lachlan Macquarie, from the street widths to, well, proportions, layouts, you name it, he set the pattern for the street plan, town planning in Australia, which is just overflowing with significant important numbers, and again built off this geometry. So for instance, the towns that when he arrived, he redesigned some towns to make them fit this plan better, but he also set up a number of towns from scratch, and he included Pythagorean theorem, especially the vesica here, this 2:3 ratio, or 8x12 chains. 2:3 ratio. So, but it's also repeated in other ways in Borobudur. And so, for instance, there are 72 Buddha statues on the circular top platforms, 432 Buddha statues on the lesser ones, but just to focus on this top pattern. And to begin with, we have 72 on 3 layers, which is 32 and 24 and 16, which also gives this, so 16 to 24, you could simplify, divide it by 16 by 8 is 2, and 24 divided by 8 is 3, so a 3:2 ratio. But also beneath that 32 to 24 is a 3:4 ratio, which again incorporates this important vesica feature, would be a Pythagorean triangle. Now that all relates back to Pythagorean music as well, and I believe it's much older than, same with Pythagorean theorem, much older than what the credit would go. But we see again this 3:2 and 3:4 music ratio still with us today, one of the basis of music theory. So what you find is that ancient Egypt, well, pretty much across the world, these architectural structures, these grand ones, these are not just some random, they went to massive efforts to put these things together, and the architects all seem to be either working off the same tradition, or, well, how do they get to, because you can find this in important modern cathedrals, up to the modern, even modernist architecture, buildings connected to people who clearly practice this older tradition. But you find it in the, well, ancient structures as well. So this Borobudur's been about the 10th century, maybe 8th century, not sure exact date at the moment, I can't remember offhand, but, well, over 1,000 years old. And in much older temple, in the Eastern Mediterraneans, back to megalith sites in all in France and the UK, and you'll find it also repeated so often in even Egyptian temples, especially the older places as well. So the question really is this, can this really be called a coincidence? And that sort of seems to be the standard model, because there is this, well, it's been basically written down as a law that all these cultures aren't really connected. If it is, it's just well, no, it's more to say they are not connected, that they develop their units of measure independently, that they so beautifully connect and harmonize at very special numbers as well. This is just not tackled by the mainstream, if you want to call it that. Well, actually it is, because there are many mainstream historians, architectural historians, archaeologists who do talk about this. They just don't get traction very much. They're, I suppose, a bit like we're very gatekeepers in the establishment view. They're also gatekeepers in, let's just call it the alternative view. And there has been well, okay, I admit I have a confirmation bias myself, but seems both sides of this argument have been polarized, and nothing that's outside of the dogmatic view, the orthodoxy, even including the unorthodox side of the debate. But what we do is you do find these things repeated again and again. So is it a global symphony of coincidence across time, across cultures, back to the beginning of recorded history? Is it a pattern which is being passed on through travel and trade? And the more artifacts that are found, we find that the ancient trade routes are much larger and much older than what is generally accepted. Even the mainstream views of things like the typical BBC documentaries really haven't caught up with the bulk of the findings. Or the third question is this like something in our DNA? Are these, just like human beings are drawn towards symmetry and, well, harmony as well? Like you can't just, a bit like that newfangled classical music, which is all discordant. It's, maybe the people in it can appreciate it because of the technicalities of it, but to the person listening to it, it's just horrible. It's discordant, and we lend towards symmetry. We lend ourselves towards harmony. It is in us, but this is the $64,000 question. Has it been passed on? Is it pure coincidence? Well, really, you can just throw that out the window. Or is it part of is there a book or a system of teaching that has been passed down through time, connecting all these other cultures? I would lean between, there has been teachings, but there is also an element where it is like literally in our evolution, in our DNA, that we love these things. We're drawn to symmetry. We're drawn to harmony. Like when we hear a pleasant note, it's generally 99% of the time, most people will favour the harmonious note. Some people will be drawn to the discordant. Some people are drawn to the asymmetric. But generally speaking, as an overwhelming majority, we like harmony and we like symmetry, and this seems to be built into the architecture. And so these features in Borobudur, there is some. Okay, where's a mandala? Okay, so this is an example of a Borobudur plan, also in Prambanan, and, well, again, the Vasta Shastru and this ancient teachings which are known about in the East, but can be also found in the West as well. So anyway, 2 to 3 ratio, the Vesica, and how it can link so many apparently separated cultures, and especially through the architecture and systems of weights and measure, because I think that's the key one. Because with weights and measure and these architectural proportions, you can really lock it. It really is posing a question because, because you can weigh it, you can measure it, and that these things come together is very significant. And I think one of the best ways to challenge the orthodox view on things, because it can't be lost in translation. You can, till the cows come home, you can argue the meaning of symbols. You can argue the connection or similarities between various legends, but there will always be this reasonable doubt in there that can be inserted because it's just hard to pin it down. However, with the use of specific measures, specific proportions, and that these proportions come back to significant, important numbers, which will not only important in the religious sense, but are also based in geometry and arithmetic, beautiful numbers, and so for the architects who are designing something such as this, you have to understand maths, you have to understand geometry. You can't do it otherwise, because how do you replicate these? How do you do it without these things? And again, there's like a very strong bias that Pythagorean theorem, delium problem that they were solved, during the Greek period, but we find in the architecture, we find the evidence of it, again, going back across time, across cultures, archaeoastronomy especially, linking all these things as well. There really is a visible trace, measurable trace, that can be repeated, has been repeated, and is put in these grand temples. And the architects who did these, who drew up these plans, they were, how did they come to the same thing over and over and over again? So not just in a symbolic sense, but also in the measurable, tangible, way you can count it, and it is repeated. If it was a random world, as most often would like to be believed and described, these things would not happen. Yet they do, and they consistently, how many coincidences makes a pattern? Well, that's arbitrary, but sometimes coincidence eventually has to become, all the time. At a point, a repeated coincidence is an indication of a pattern. With that, have a good one. Okay, so look a little bit more at Borobudur Temple in Indonesia, and especially sacred numbers and those things connected with it. So to begin with, we have basically you have two separate levels. You have like a square level at the bottom and a circular level at the top, and you have a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then 1, 2, 3, which is interesting. So firstly, it's a 3:5 ratio, which is nice on its own. Think Fibonacci. But then you also have this stupa at the top, and that would be the 9th level, and the number 9 being so significant in not just Buddhism, Jains and Hindus as well, and of course, even though in Western Pythagorean schools, for instance. But what you have is the first two levels have 108 niches. Each niche has a Buddha inside it, so that's 104 on the first two. Now you can connect this with so many other Hindu Buddhist temples. For instance, Phnom Penh in Cambodia, part of an Angkor complex, where there are 72 major temples, but there are 104 towers arranged around the outside. 108 bells, most of them collapsed, but of these towers, 104. And it's interesting, from ground level, the most you can ever see is 33 at one time, as in 33 gods on Mount Meru. So 104 connections there, but then the next level, so the third level, the first two being 104 each. Now, half of 104 is 52, which is, weeks per year, because 7-day week seems to be an international standard going back through ancient periods. Half of that, 26, and then down to 13. So like the base number, again, you could call almost 13. 13, 5 levels, 3 levels, 8 in total. There you already have a nice, there's a lot of Fibonacci stuff going on in here as well, just as an example. But the third level has 88 niches, and so there are 88 Buddha, the repentance ceremony. For instance, in Japan there are 88 temples connected, Buddhist temples connected together, and many other aspects you could go into 88, but just that's one of the references immediate. Now the next level up has 72 niches, and that's interesting also because there are 72 Buddha in the stupa, in like the bell, they're housed inside these bells on the top. And I'll go into 72 later, it's very important. And the next is 64 niches, and we'll go into more of these later, but just to do a quickie this time. So it gives you 432 in total. Now the number 432, okay, we go straight to that one. So for instance, the diameter of the sun in the long foot scale, which is 33 times 32 to get 1056, but anyway, 432 in the long foot scale gives you the diameter of the sun, 43,200 miles the radius of the sun. But also on the long scale, that's 432 once again. But as we'll see with these other numbers, they're not just connected to Eastern tradition, you also find them in the West as well. Similar thing happening also in Mayan and Mesoamerican cultures, but for instance the Kali Yuga, 43,200 years. Ragnarok in Valhalla, that there are 140 doors, wide enough to allow 800 warriors out. That's 432,000 once again. In the Manu cycle, the greater again cycle now, 4,432, 4,320,000 years, 432. The Ark of Utnapishtim from the Epic of Gilgamesh, Preserver of Life, this cube, 432, again, references in there. And that can also be found in New Jerusalem, the description of, especially, well, all of them, because they're using stadia. The King James Version uses furlong, but, well, 360 degrees. And this will come back in, because, for instance, there are 432 Indonesias. There are 72 Buddhas in the bells at the top, the stupas. Now together that's 504, but 432 minus 72 is 360, and in the Eastern tradition there are 360 days per year. Now that extends to Egypt, the Romans and the Mayans as well. And the 300, well, from the vesica, this fundamental unit of sacred geometry, the inside angle of that rhombus, which is also the inside angle of a hexagon, 432,000 seconds. A on Pythagorean tuning as well, but you also have, so Greco-Roman, other weight scales, you'll see 432 grains to the ounce. So weights and measure systems all across these cultures coming together in a symbolic sense and a measurable sense as well. So it's also willing, so the Rig Veda is said to consist of 432,000 syllables. Again, now that's important because these traditions will lead into, for instance, there's no strict Buddhist calendar system, but there are many parallels from the Rig. So, because essentially Buddhists, Jains, Hindus do share. So this is one of the oldest Buddhist Buddha statues, and all the Buddhas still have this symbol now. This is the Jain symbol, and this is a classic Hindu symbol as well. So you see this, especially in across Asia, Southeast Asia, down into so from Indonesia up into China and across to India. Also the Kushan into, well, across to the west as well, because especially Greeks, Romans also were using this symbol. There's a long tradition, connections between Hindus, Buddhists, and especially to the Greco-Roman world, especially through the Kushan Empire, which was famous for Greco-Buddhist architecture. But so that'll be a connection. That'll be in the next one, where these calendar systems, measure systems come together. For instance, the Tale, the T-A-L-E, is said to be a unit connected to Borobudur, and those, okay, and Angkor Wat as well. We'll see 432, 1728, 864, and these other sets of numbers emerging in the measurement systems as well, which so neatly tie into the yugas, for instance. But that'll be next, because I will cover in more detail, especially the number 72, and because that's one of the key ones here in Borobudur, and well, other places. It's a standard that goes across. You'll find it in measures related to sun, earth, moon, and the stars as well. You'll see it in, well, countless forms: Christian, Hellenistic, ancient Egyptian, Hindus, Buddhists, Jains as well. Very, very important sets of numbers. And with that, hope you have a good one. There'll be more to come on this. Next will be a focus on 72 and how that again connects across not just Hindus, Buddhists, but also ancient Egypt and, well, other places as well. Very, very strong tradition. All is number, all is mind, all is consciousness. But what is geometry and number are the universal languages. They can't be lost in translation. So if you embed these sacred numbers into your structure, and then you use if you use a specific set of measures, and you would base a measure on a certain feature, so what they say about the unit of measure at Borobudur, it is called the tala, which is from the tip of your hairline to the tip of your chin. Man is a measure of all things. Okay, have a good one. More to come. But now, for instance, covered the square portions, or as they move up, but the fourth of those is 72 niches with little Buddha statues on the inside. And then on the circular part at the top, what we have is 32, 24, and 16. So altogether 72 as there on the circular section at the top, and the importance of this number 72. So for instance, in Angkor Wat, there are 72 major temples in the larger Angkor complex. Again, cross time, cross religions, cultures, the globe. Now, for instance, Osiris, he was murdered by Set, and there were 72 co-conspirators along with Set in the murdering of Osiris. And every 72nd day was one from the moon. Now that has a connection because, well, 5 times 72 is 360, and also that leaves those 5 days of that intermediate between 300 and 365 days. Direct connection here, and I'll come back to that in the next part, because the Rig Veda and the 360-day calendar system, plus for 5 days, which will connect Rome, which they derive so much from Egypt, but also the Mayans have the same system, which is also blends nicely to the Vedic Hindu system as well, but 72 in ancient Egypt. So for instance, more on the Rig Veda, but for instance, formed with 12 spokes by length of time unweakened, rolls round the heavens these wheels of during order, therein established, joined in pairs together, 700 suns and 20 stands, 720. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, 72 also appears as a rather important number. Now, for instance, there were 72 demons or jinn captured, controlled by King Solomon, while Jesus sent out 72 disciples in Luke 10. Quite a few interesting ones in regards to Judeo-Christian, and there is another important one. The Old Testament, as we know it now, was actually compiled, translated into Greek in Egypt during the Ptolemaic period. Now it's often referred to as, and part of my pronunciation, Septuagint, which translates into the 70. So there were either 70 or, by some descriptions, 72 scholars who were involved in this translation of the Old Testament. So 6 from each of the 12 tribes, 6 times 12 being 72. But also in the Zohar, for instance, Jacob's ladder in that tradition has 72 degrees or levels or rungs. In the more recent Kabbalah, for instance, Kircher, this important a Jesuit, but also who links through Hermeticism, the alchemy of the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries. There's 72 names of God, which links into the Shem, Ham. So I always get that pronunciation there, have it there. But again, this Kabbalist tradition from the Tetragrammaton, which would also apply to the Tetractys, and Shin. But what we have is 72 parts, or 216 letters in there as well. So 72 being important in the Judeo-Christian. But also in China, I didn't mention it here, but for instance, the Stars of Destiny, 108 in total, but 72 earthly fiends and 36 heavenly, what's the term? I didn't call them angels precisely, but anyway, that's connected. But Sun Wukong, monkey, the Monkey King, he was able to perform 72 transformations. There are 72 postures in Shaolin, including Big Lu Han, and there were 72 disciples of Confucius. Now, this theme of 72 will have again deeper connection, so I'm just sticking with 72, but again across these different cultures now in measured sun, earth, moon and stars. And so, for instance, 72 years is 1 degree of precession. That's working off a 360 compass, but we'll come back to the importance of 360, how it relates also here. But whether it's the sun, and again the ionic and the long scale, 1.056 feet is 1 long foot, and 1056 is 32 times 33. Now 32 is repeated throughout here as well, and 33 gods on Mount Meru, so there's nice connections there, but not for this episode. But also measure, again, the long and the ionic scale describe the diameter of a moon, but also 720 league, or 3 mile is 1 league. Well, that's again, so sun, earth, moon and stars. And the earth itself, because the earth precession and the sun and the stars join up in there. And also because of a movement of a precession, the axial precession is the movement of a North Star. And well, there are a few, especially like Angkor and these other places. Well, there's some astronomical connections here in Borobudur, but also in Angkor. There's a nice thing like the solstice and the equinox. It's all in there. It's just it's a standard, really. It'd be harder to find a place that one of these older special temples that does not have these alignments. But 72 in geometry, whether it's a pentagram or a pentagon, again the vesica, the internal. So 120 degrees is the interior angle of the hexagon, which is of course emerges from the vesica. That's 77,200 minutes, which would be 43,200 seconds. That was the last episode, this 432 connections. Now also to the golden number, but also the tetrahedron as well, 720 degrees, which is a nice link to fire once more. And again, you see the hexagon. So not just the angle itself does it convert to minutes, 7,200, but 120 times 6 is the defining angle of the inside of a hexagon. Room temperature, 72 degrees Fahrenheit. That's a bit arbitrary in there, but what you'll see is still in modern systems like the screen, the 720p, and also the, for instance, Greco-Roman measure systems. You'll find it in other places as well, also musical applications. Also worth noting, 72 heartbeats per minute, and the body is about 72% water. So this number 72 pretty important. Now in the Mayan, the Katun, 7,200 days, but also in the Yuga, so the Para Yuga is 864,000, double the, well, there's a 432 in the Yugas, but this is broken up into groups of 72. So the entry period, the body of the Para Yuga, and then the exit period, and they're all reflections of 72 as well. It's also like 720 minutes per day, daytime, and 720 minutes per night as well, which is a nice link as well. So 72, very important number, again, cross cultures, traditions, especially, but in modern, again, this must repeat, in the modernist architecture of major public buildings, cathedrals, etc., they always incorporate these same sets of numbers, including 72, it's or 720 as well, but also always just one order of magnitude up or down from 72. Not only is it across cultures in the ancient world, it's still being used now in new structures. For instance, countless numbers. So whether it's 72 feet high obelisks, 72 this, 72 there, or even the other units, always comes down to the same basic set of harmonic numbers. Beautiful numbers in a purely mathematical sense, but also lovely numbers in a geometric sense, which also lovely convert to sun, earth, moon and stars measures and systems of measure traditions. It just is. So this is another example, whether it's from the ancient structures, stone circles, because there are 72 feet, you'll find very often in there, and even the other units will break down into divisions of even in megalithic system as well, but also what you have is multiple ancient scales of measure which apparently are separated, but they always, at these structures, in whether it's the number of stone or the proportions or the actual measure systems themselves, you find a harmonic between allegedly modern systems and these ancient systems. It just always happens. It's clearly, well, to me, it's clear as day that, there is something to it. If it was purely, you can't use coincidence, you can't just call it random. How they got there, well, okay, that's an open question, but there is this tradition. So whether it's been passed on and taught, or whether it's built into our very structure ourselves, well, how can you prove that? I don't know, but what you can prove is by studying the overwhelming bulk of them, not just one or two, but you'll find that cross time, cross cultures, cross the world, including in the modern period where allegedly a lot of this stuff had apparently has been left behind, and you'll find that in the whether it's I.M. Norman Foster, sculptors such as Tony Rosenfeld, and well, you just see the same names, same architects popping up with the same measures, same numbers. It's just carrying on. It's there. It can be measured. It can be tested, and the interesting thing is that it actually predicts, and that's the important part of a theory. A theory should predict, and what you find is that these architects, these famous architects, or when they build a brand new major cathedral or a brand new parliamentary building or a presidential palace or a temple, they always keep referring back to this. Not only will it explain the past, it does predict the future. Hello SGD, Sacred Geometry Decoded. This will be episode 4 in this look at Borobudur Temple in Indonesia and how these same symbols, emblems connect not just in the East but also to the Western esoteric tradition. And now we'll look at the number 73. 72 was the last bit of focus. So there we have a couple of views, and especially this the three circular platforms there at the top, and they're not actually circular, they're slightly oblate, is that the term for it, but a little bit flattened on each side. And each of those, that's what you're seeing. So those bells or stupas, that's what you're seeing there, and this particular Buddha doesn't have the complete housing on top or stupa, but that's what you're seeing. These are on the top three platforms. Now there are 400 in niches, like in little alcoves, little holes in the wall. There are 432 in total on the lower levels, and then these three levels, what we have is 72 Buddha statues underneath these housings. However, there is one extra stupa there on top, and so we have 72 of these Buddhas enclosed statues in these stupas. Three levels, 32, 24 and 16, so 72 altogether. But we have the 73rd, what we have is another stupa there on top, so 73 in total, 72 plus 1. And that's an important theme, because what we're really having is 72 around the 73rd, and this is not included in most of the top discussions of it. And it's actually an important theme, because this again will be seen throughout this esoteric occult themes that's repeated across tradition. So for instance, Osiris, he was killed by his brother Set, and Set had 72 accomplices or disciples that conspired with him against Osiris, making Set the 73rd. Also worth noting is that the different Bibles have different makeups, but the Catholic Bible is made up of 73 books. So in Luke 10 it describes there were 72 disciples sent out by Jesus. Now even in the Greek translation, the Old Testament, back to Ptolemy II, or either 70 or 72 translators. However, but in Luke 10, 72 disciples sent out, making Jesus the 33rd. Jacob's ladder, so you could also but Jacob's ladder, 72 degrees or steps up the ladder, and that would include the 73rd step being off the ladder, or alternatively onto it. But you would start you have to go up 72 levels, and then the 73rd would be into Jacob's ladder story. You can look into that. Very important also in the Masonic tradition. So the 73rd would be an important feature there. Confucius had over 3,000 disciples, but 72 disciples succeeded in their higher education. So 72 important senior disciples, making Confucius the 73rd. So this is another reference. Now 73 is a very important number. For instance, it's the 21st prime number, and 37 is the 12th, so just reverse the digits. But also that I've done some videos on how 37, 55, 73 appears in tradition architecture, especially connected to these hidden in plain sight themes. So 72, very important, but also this reference to the 73rd, where again the central stupa, the defining on this would be the ninth level. So there are 5 square levels, 3 circular levels, and then 8, and then the ninth is the highest one. And I think that's a reflection in there. Now you can find there are many okay, I'll do some more because this will actually lends into Rig Vedas and the 360-day cycle as used in so for instance in Hindus they have 360 days, but the day, I forget the exact term for it, but they divide the year into 360 days, but each day is actually a little bit longer than the sunrise sunset day. There is a different connection there, but that would also relate to Thoth. So he won every 72nd day from the moon, and then you have the 5 days which are important for the birth of the gods. The Mayans had a 360-day year plus 5 days. Romans 360 days plus 5 years as well. I'll put the link in the description. I did a video in there showing how these, again, different cultures where this 360 plus 5 days is an important recurring theme as well. So it's not just the number, for instance, 360 or 72. It's also you need to, usually they have, let's just call it a margin of error, which is very important because I've been looking into weights and measure systems, and the margin of error actually encodes information. So there is always this next level, the next little step above, which leads to something, another set of information. It's like an onion. There are layers and layers and layers, and you need to go down further into them. And the difference is also an important theme. Also worth noting that line there, but that will be for this. Okay, that's for something else. But yeah, so 72 and the 73rd is an important recurring theme that you need to include. Now, for instance, 13, there are 12 steps usually to a gallows, and then the 13th step onto the gallows. Now there are 13. Not traditionally, there should be 13 loops on the hangman's noose to reflect the 12 jurors and the ultimate judge, just like 12 people in the jury plus the judge, or 12 people on the board plus the 13th being the chairman or chairperson these days. The 12 disciples plus Jesus the 13th. So this is another theme where these important repeated numbers, then you have this added element to it which connects to other information. So anyway, with that, hope you enjoyed. Have a good one. Hello, SGD, Sacred Geometry Decoded. This will be episode 5 in Borobudur and the temple in Indonesia, a Buddhist temple, but their connections to other traditions, Hindu and Egyptian, and especially some interesting Greek connections as well. So the temple famously 432 Buddhas in the niches on the squarish part, and 72 Buddhas inside a stupa on the circular top part. So that's 504 in total. Now what's interesting is that 5,040 is this very interesting number. Now if you include the stupa on the top, what you actually have is 9 levels. And so even in Baha'i, and they have a 9-sided room, well, the nonagon, for instance, that's 140 degrees, defines the angle, which leads to 504 seconds. 42 consecutive, 42, nice. But Plato's number, ideal number of citizens in a city, was 5,040. Now why that would be, well, also 1 times 2 times 3, as in 7 days, this being cross cultures, this 7-day week being an important theme. Even when they had instead of 5 weeks of 6 days, what you have is 4 weeks of 7 days, 28 days, which is again connects to the lunar mansions, for instance, in Hindu Vedic tradition, but also the sidereal month. But for the moment, that's still like a nice one. But what I mean by that is what's also linked to the Greek world would be, for instance, when you look at Pythagoras, he was into reincarnation. A lot of Buddhist Indian, Hindu, Vedic themes going on through this period, and it's also at the same timeline. So, but also we know that not only were the Greeks learning from the Egyptians, but they were also learning through to the east, including, we know, with trade, transport, and people around the time of Pythagoras were speaking with, exchanging information through the the early Buddhist period, but also to India and the Hindus. But what you have, especially now Alexander's time and Bactria, now what you have is Greco-Buddhist architecture. So in the Buddhist world, you see this basically Greek sculpture emerges from this earlier different types of artistic traditions. All of a sudden we get these types of depictions. And we also get the use of the Corinthian column with the Buddhist in the center. Now if you look up the Kushan Empire, Greco-Buddhist architecture, or Greco-Buddhism, because at that same time there were decrees being sent out around Alexander's time encouraging that the Greeks become Buddhist. So we have an exchange going both ways, not just one way. But that's one link to consider. But the calendar systems. Now, okay, so 432 plus 72 is 504, but 432 minus 72 is 360. Now, I'll put all these links in the description. So strictly speaking, a system of time reckoning, which is peculiar to Buddhism, not really there. You can see it from the Vedic Hindu transit being passed on. So, for instance, in the Rig Veda, 700 suns and 720, but also the use of the 360. So, 12 other fellas, the wheel is single. There are the naves, a man has understood it. Therein are set together 360, which no wise can be loosened. Now that's multiple aspects of connection. Now I'll put this link in the description. Fantastic stuff. Jay Caprath, he also talks about Anne Balkans. And they break down the geometry, number, the patterns inside the Parthenon, and how they connect directly to Vedic fire altars, which themselves contain all sorts of, well, just the math is connected, just extraordinary stuff, including the calendar system. So what you have is, it's like the quadrivium, it's as above. No number has it's about time, distance, area, symbolism, traditions, all coming together, and it's a fantastic presentation, sorry. Again, because it's, it's one of those things where it should be, having millions of views, but it's, again, low views because, well, it's not. Well, anyway, I won't go into that, but the connection between Greek, Vedic, and Buddhist traditions also would be blending in there. Now, for instance, what we have is the Greek canonical year, 360 days. It's halfway between the 354 lunar days in a lunar year and the 365 solar days. A nice link, because the Typhus was a lunar year of 354 days was divided into 360 Typhus. So it was a slight a day and a fraction off from that to divide it into those units, which in the Parthenon and other places you can find converts to 365.24 days. The way that they were able to correct the calendar with the cycle, it's all built into the math here, and the numbers connect to the harmonics. Just extraordinary set of connections, but it's on the outside of both the alternative and the mainstream, because, well, math, but now, I did a video a while back looking into this. It's plenty of stuff out there now. For instance, the Mayan calendar, they had a 360-day year plus 5 days, like a period of rebirth. Now that connects to the Egyptian calendar, at least the anyway, even the older Egyptian. But for instance, Ombo, which was a Ptolemaic temple, is essentially built by Greeks. Now in Egypt, you'll also find pictures of Alexander, but the Ptolemaic Greeks, beginning with Alexander, used Egyptian forms. They didn't impose Greek culture on Egypt. They actually used Egyptian forms. So Alexander in Egypt is depicted as Egyptian, but elsewhere he uses a different form. But Egyptian calendar, 360 days, 12 times 30, plus a 5-day period. Now that was the through Caesar, the Romans adopted this calendar as well, where you had 365 days plus a 5-day period where new ventures were seen as bad luck. Very similar in the way to the Mayan calendar, where we have the 5-period day of rebirth, which is a nice link to the older Egyptian calendar and connected to Thoth. So back to 72, nice link here. So 360 in the 365-day calendar. So the story is that it was 360 days per year, but Thoth won every 1 in 72 from the sun. So 360 divided by 72 is 5, and he won 5 days, during which time Nut and Geb gave birth to the gods such as Osiris, Isis, and Set, which again, this 5-day period of birth, which someone commented recently on this post as well, that also tallies in nicely with the solstice as well, to give you that period of 360 days plus this 5-day period, rebirth, the solstice as well. So there's nice links going on there, and also to the 72 and this 360 thing, and to Thoth as well, 72. And but also, well, 432 minus 72, 360. It's okay. I'll put this link in as well, because the connections. Now, I did posted a few, but just recently, the importance of 108 in the East, where Buddhist, Jains, Hindus, Vedic tradition, Prambanan in Indonesia, not far away, that also has the mandala built in there. You'll find it's the same floor plan as Angkor Wat and temples of Angkor Wat, and there are 72 major temples in Angkor Wat. But if you could just even pause and read through here how 36, 72, 108 all come back together, because for instance, 144, that's 2 times 72, 72 divided by 2 is 360. Okay, might as well forgot to make the card, but in the Chinese literature, the stars of destiny, there are 108 stars, 36 divine, 72 earthly demons as well. So whether it's 36 times 2 is 72, 36 times 3 is 108, 108 times 3 is 432. No, that's 324. Sorry, 108 times 4 is 432, or 72 times 6, is it? Yeah, so, but where it's 36, 72, 108, 144, it all comes back to numbers such as 432 and 864 and 1296, which are built into the yugas as well. And Angkor Wat, you'll see this, all these temples, Eastern and Western, have this going back in time. Now, even 360, now for instance, the Treta Yuga, that's 3600 divine years, or 1,296,000 years. There are 1,296,000 seconds in a 360-degree compass. 1296 divided by 3 is 432, but whether it's moon measures, 360-degree compass, 3,600 seconds per hour. The Mayan tun, in geometry, it's just whether it's phi, the vesica, the pentagon, platonic solids, whether it's a circle or a square, this use of 360, which you could also link to the Babylonian Sumerian system, base 60, which is really comes down to 12, for instance. Now, all of these are also 12 times 3 is 36 grain per foot. These weights and measure ancient systems, again, Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Greco-Roman, Greco-Buddhist, but also back to the Vedic and Buddhist systems, traditions. And this use of number being it cannot be lost in translation. And if you include that with weights and measure systems, and for instance, in these temples and Angkor Wat and other ones, you'll also see market scenes where people are weighing and measuring goods. And again, yes, ancient systems of weights and measure, it's a way to encode astronomy / astrology, arithmetic, musical proportions, and geometry. And of course, the designs of these temples are entirely geometric. You can't do it without a good grasp of geometry. and that's especially these more like the mandala and other ones. It emerges from the vesica essentially, compass and straight edge geometry, and then combined with numbers built into the legend, but also built into the architecture itself, and then the systems of weights and measures, the length of ships, the purport. It's all in there and just repeated, and it's a masterful system. It's a way to pass knowledge on. So if it gets lost in one area, well, in the quadrivium, music, geometry, arithmetic, and astronomy. If you're into your astronomy, you're going to learn about the other three by default. If you're not a big fan of astronomy but you like music, then the musical proportions will lead you to astronomical, geometric, arithmetic knowledge. It's a beautiful system, beautiful, and then embedded into religious traditions and texts. So you might learn the stories as a child. You might, through your whole life, you might never understand it. But if these lessons keep getting passed on, it's so easy to then extract geometry, arithmetic, music, and astronomy from there. And how do you build these temples? Well, you need these acoustic properties of these temples, the stone bells or the metal bells that they make. It's all in there, and it is repeated again across cultures. So this series has been on Borobudur in Indonesia, but I've done others on, if it's the Parthenon or pyramids or stone circles in Western Europe. The same themes are just repeated consistently over, and especially through measure as well. They just always repeated, and it comes back to it. This is the underlying theme of these. This is how through the economy or through the academies where you learn music, etc. It just repeated. It's the same themes, even if it's just purely ritualistic, traditional, and the legends. Well, it's buried in there as well, and you just pull a few threads and bang, there it is, all again. It's repeated. Excellent system of knowledge, and these are textbooks in stone. That's what they are. Whether it's a traditional hypostyle temple like the Parthenon or what's the name now? Luxor and Karnak, or if it's a pyramid or a stupa, or just a more formal, traditional stupa. It's the same things are just repeated over and over again. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed. Have a good one. Hello, SGD, Sacred Geometry Decoded. This will be part 6 of this episode 6, looking at Borobudur in Indonesia, and using again this as a stepping stone to look at other connections joining other sites and traditions. And so from the aerial view, what you have is the mandala, not to be confused with the mandorla or the almond, but and this particular pattern, which is a important one. So not too far away, also in Indonesia, we have Prambanan, and that's strictly a Hindu temple. And there again, we can see the temple layout where we have the mandala again, or the yantra, geometric pattern. So it's used in many applications. So here we see another depiction of it. Now, usually the gates are T-shaped as well, which would be reminiscent of some other places, but I wouldn't directly link them immediately. But it represents the universe. It's what the mandala does. Now, it's a way of laying out temples, but also they often make out of sand, like temporary ones. It's also to arrange sacred spaces used for ritual as well, but it can be applied on a large scale to permanent architecture. And again, representing the cosmos. So this shows again what these temples are pointing at, what they represent. And Phnom Penh, for instance, in Angkor, that's just one example. You'll many temples there in Angkor complex are connected to the mandala. And it's interesting that Phnom Penh has 104 of these towers. From ground level, only 33 are visible at maximum from ground level at one time, whatever your angle is. And as I say, 33 gods on Mount Meru. This is another repeated theme throughout as well. Now that's 104 is interesting because the first two levels of Borobudur each have 104 niches with little Buddhas inside. So that's the first two, but this use of 104. And you see it appearing in other places. Now, I think half of that would be 52 weeks per year, and then that's half of that 26, and break it down to 13. So 13 would be the base number to emerge from that. Now 13 and 33 and 13, straight away some might get the connection between there. York Rite 13, Scottish Rite 33, and there's nice links to that, but we'll look closer. But this pattern is also the templum of the sky, or the constitutio limitum, which is an ancient survey technique going back to Roman times to lay out a city as well. Now that's a nice link, because when the Spanish arrived in Tenochtitlan, which is current day Mexico, one of them noted were the Romans here, because what they found was this Roman layout design as well. This seemed to be like a universal theme pointing as well. That's just a curiosity. I wouldn't direct, but now we also have the Vastu Shastra, which translates in Sanskrit to the science of architecture, and the way of it's basically like the Indian version of feng shui. Now, Surya, for instance, the sun god would be nice links there, because we go back to the various levels here in Borobudur, and so the Vastu Shastra of a square, often like laid out for. There are many variations of it, but the 4x4 16 and the 64, the 8x8 square, is a pretty prominent one, but goes up to 32 by 32. So we have 32 stulpas there, and it's the 1024 pattern. So these ones have these nice links in there. But what's the nicest part is that if you include the top stupa, so what we have is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, then 1, 2, 3 on the circular level, so 8. Then we have the top level, which gives us 9 levels in total, which connects to the Navagraha, which is again this nice connection in there to these ancient Vedic Hindu systems of architecture or ritual as well. And you even see the T-gates, the T-shaped gates there, and the Philfot, the swastika connections in there as well. Now, for instance, Mercury, Venus, Moon, Mars, Jupiter, Sun, Saturn, plus these two, which are the lunar ascending and lunar descending nodes. These are the 9 planets in Hindu Vedic tradition. But notice that the Sun is at the center. So what we have is a 9 square plan that also connects through there, 9 square, and we have 9 levels here. The mandala itself represents the cosmos, the universe, and when we have the 9 planets emerging from there with, again, the Sun at the center. Now this will link to the modern esoteric Hermetic Western tradition, but I wouldn't say modern, I would say the modern incarnation of it, because it's actually been passed through time. But let's look, for instance, New Haven in the USA, or Bathurst here in Australia. And I'll put a link in the description. Half a Sheep channel went and spoke to an architect, Henry Bialowas, who back in the 80s or the late 70s tried to write his thesis on sacred architecture, and it was not well received. I'll put that link. It's an interesting interview, because he was talking about these going back, well, long before the internet's made it sort of popular, and just the reception it got. Now it's, well, a bit more acceptable, but one of the places he was particularly interested in was Bathurst, which was founded by Governor Macquarie, who I'm interested in because of the way he laid out other towns, and the street plans and the widths of the street, all based on the numbers. Just beautiful stuff connecting. But what's interesting is with the 9 square plan, well, we see that in New Haven, and we also see it in the original plan of Bathurst. And what's most important is, for instance, here in Bathurst, as Henry Bialowas points out, the central square where the church goes is unbordered, and it is unnumbered. And we have the same thing in the oldest plan for New Haven, where the church square, the central square, except for this one drafting line, I would assume, but again, it's they've gone out of their way to make it different. And what, as Henry Bylaw says, what cannot be named, what cannot be numbered. Essentially, it's the omega point of the town plan. Now, well, connections to New Haven, Yale University. Well, there we have Lock and Key and these other secret society buildings, and especially Skull and Bones, where we have these esoteric architecture and traditions linking back through to the modern era, linking back to the ancient era. And so, for instance, do I have a... no. Oh, anyway, the architecture there in New Haven, is it Scroll and Key, Lock and Key, Book and Scroll? I forget the exact name of these other lesser known societies apart from Skull and Bones, where we have the same. We have Caduceus, the Ionic, Doric, Corinthian, and so many other symbols built into the town plan. So even though they may appear very different, even though we might assume because of the cultural differences, the differences in time, and the assumptions we make about how things operate in their well, what you actually find is that the same patterns, numbers, traditions go back in time, and they link the East and the West. And for instance, now the old ancient Mexico, Tenochtitlan, but also in other sites, Mesoamerican sites, where we have the same, so 108 feet, 216 feet, the same, like similar orientations, even the connections now. Now also, for instance, in the Navagraha, where we have Mercury, and well, this is also, you could directly connect these to not only like the 7 visible planets plus the lunar ascending and descending nodes, but also to the alchemical tradition, as in the Sun, gold, the Moon, silver, Mars, iron, copper, Venus, Mercury. Now these are also, whether it's Mesoamerican, whether it's Far East Asia, India, the Middle East, or the Mediterranean, such Egypt, Greece, and other places. These are the essence of metallurgy as well. So Mercury, all these cultures are, gold, silver, copper. Anyway, it's all there. So you see multiple layers, multiple forms. And now, for instance, a 9 square plan, that would lend itself to be made, because you can't make a 10 square plan, because then it wouldn't be a square. But that these similar features, such as in the unnumbered or the unmarked, just like that 9th stupa at the very top there, so it's separate, it sits higher, it sits different from the rest, it's special in very similar formats. And the use of these particular numbers in not just symbolic senses, but especially in the units of measure as well. So you have a mandala, Vastu Shastra, these ancient symbols, and the connecting east to west. Hindus, Buddhists, you'll find similar themes in Islamic architecture. Not too long ago, they found the oldest surviving Quran, and a large part of that Quran was architectural plans and designs. The units of in Islamic units of weights and measure, we see them drawn from, or directly connecting to Byzantine and Roman as well. But and they coming from ancient Egypt, Persia, Sumer, Babylon, and all these other places. So you just find the same repeated themes. That they're not connected is an assumption. That's not, that was a starting belief. But the more you look into things, you see just how close things are. And then if you look into trade empires and how far trade went. So, for instance, for example, well documented, the Romans were trading with India by sea. the Indians were trading with where is now Malaysia, and then they to ancient China. So with only one or two sea journeys, Chinese goods were arriving in Rome. Chinese silk was arriving in Rome in such quantity they had to bring in a special law to protect local toga manufacturers. So it's not. We find artifacts, even Egyptian artifacts, found in ancient graves in Sweden, and they just put the trade links. And if you can trade goods, you can trade knowledge, and it's just been moved across. And for instance, the Buddhist, Taoist, and Hindu connections, well, because it's Asian, so that's okay to join. But for some reason, there's like a lot of people have this imaginary line where Asians can't trade with the Near East or with Europe. Well, why? Because the trade links have always been there. The goods are clearly there. The Silk Road, portions of the Silk Road are known to extend back quite some time. And again, still, it's a very resistant thing that's going on where we just assume that because they're so far apart that they can't be in trade good connections, therefore they can't be trading knowledge. But the systems of going back to Mohenjo-daro are exactly the same weights are used in Old Kingdom Egypt, and they were again being used by Greeks, Romans, then the Islamic ounce, and the US silver dollar, the Spanish weights and measure systems, up into the English weights and measure systems. So what we do have is a continuum of temple plans, of sacred number and traditions, and town plans, architectural forms, and I think I mentioned in the last episode that the Greek connections to Buddhism and the Hindu. Anyway, with that, hope you enjoyed and have a good one. But these links are, they're quite tangible, and it's more of to remove ourselves from the mindset of separation. The ancient people were engaged in long trade, so even if the Romans weren't trading directly with the Chinese, it was only 2 or 3 sails away, boat journeys, and there the goods were there. So where goods move, people move. Where people move, knowledge moves. Have a good one. Hello SGD, Sacred Geometry Decoded, and this will be episode 7 in this look at Borobudur and how it applies to different cultures across time. Now, when we do, one of the essences of architecture? Well, geometry, but it's also what is a unit of measure that you define your building as. This is a very important theme, whether it's the Parthenon or the pyramids, it's essential. Now, there have been quite a bit of research into this, and what they're suggesting is that the unit of measure used to design Borobudur was the thala, or tailor. I'm not exactly sure pronunciation, I'll just call it thala for now. And this is one of the heads from one of the statues, Buddha statues there, and the thala is from the hairline to the chin. Now this will connect to the Greco-Buddhist influence, and will cross. Where did the Greeks and Romans learn from? From the Persians, from the Babylonians, from the Egyptians. They did not pop up out of nowhere, and that's why Greek and Roman documents are so vital in actually understanding previous civilizations, because they were not only much closer, but they were essentially the direct heirs of this earlier civilization. And it's a shame, but Greek and Roman records and architecture doesn't get included because it's so well documented it will bust the narrative open. But anyway, what is so from the forehead, from the hairline to the chin, that's 1/10 of the height of the human body. Man is the measure of all things. Pythagoras, his famous Greek architect. Now it's well known that the Greeks built their temples on perfect proportions of men. The temple as a replica of the cosmos, as above so below, but also as a temple of man. This is again a repeated theme. Now, what is that? How does this bring us to Leonardo da Vinci? Well, this famous drawing of his, Vitruvian Man. It is named after the Roman architect Vitruvius, And the 10 books of architecture by Vitruvius are a smoking gun when it comes to this, but it's not, again, it's not well like now on symmetry in temples and on the human body. The design of a temple depends on symmetry, the principles of which must be most carefully observed by the architect. They are due in proportion. They are due to proportion in Greek. I'm not sure what that would, but proportion is a correspondence among the measures of the member of an entire work and of the whole to a certain part of a selected standard, as above so below, the macrocosm and the microcosm. The small describes the large and the large describes the small. From this result the principles of symmetry. Without symmetry and proportion, there can be no principles in the design of any temple, that is, if there is no precise relation between its members, as in the case of those of a well-shaped man. For the human body is so designed by nature that the face from the chin to the top of the forehead and the lowest roots of the hair is 1/10 part of the whole height. Again, for the human body is so designed by nature that the face from the chin to the top of the forehead and the lowest roots of the hair is 1/10 the part of the whole height. From the chin to the lowest part of the forehead, of a hairline on the forehead. This is a connection. Now, furthermore, now I'll put the link in the description. This is page 96, beginning page 96 of the document, which would be, I'm not sure the page number, page 72 of the text, but page 96 of the whole document. And again, describing the proportions of the body. Man is the measure of all things. From these, measure is described. The Egyptian royal cubit, from the tip of your elbow to the tip of your finger is one Egyptian royal cubit. And similarly, okay, part 3, similarly in the members of a temple there ought to be greatest harmony in the symmetrical relationships of the different parts of the general magnitude of the whole. Then again, in the human body is the central point is naturally the navel. For if a man be placed flat on his back with his hands and feet extended and a pair of compasses centered at his navel, the fingers and toes of his 2 hands and feet will touch the circumference of a circle described therefrom. And just as the human body yields a circular outline, so too a square figure may be found for it. For if we measure the distance from the soles of the feet to the top of the head, and then apply that measure to the outstretched arms, the breadth will be found to be the same as the height, as in the case of a plane surfaces which are perfectly square. What does that mean? Well, we have the Vitruvian man described. So Da Vinci, his machines, his drawings were just a retelling of ancient text. Essentially, Vitruvius, the 10 books of architecture. Outstretched arms, the circle, and the square. This is exactly where Vitruvian man comes from. This is then again in the human body, the central point is naturally the navel. Now, the central point, the navel, the belly button. Now, what happens is, okay, Marco Vitruvius, he described the proportions of Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian architecture. Here we have the Salamis stone, which is a conversion tool between various units of measure. So the width of the Salamis stone is a square root of 3 Egyptian royal cubits. We also have the Doric, Ionic, and the so-called modern English foot described therein in this particular stone. It's a 2:3 ratio. Part of it's missing, but we can work out the missing part, well, 2:3, because where does that lead to? Where would that corner lead to? Well, if we superimpose that, and in this blue portion there we have the axis of symmetry, the navel. Now, what's also interesting is that from your feet, base of your feet to your navel should be 1 meter. Then to the rest, to the top, from your navel to the top of your head, it should be 1 Egyptian royal cubit plus 1 foot. 6 foot. The meter plus the cubit plus the foot equals 6 feet. And this is, now it's interesting that this Vitruvian man also matches a Salamis stone, how these points all join and describe the parts, where described very literally here in this document. The Greeks Romans learnt from earlier civilizations. They describe the proportions, they describe the temple proportions and the principles of temple building. We can literally measure it in ancient, older civilizations. They also, in Vitruvius, he also describes the machines for lifting. He describes the principles of timber and stone and how they should be used for, and how to work with them, and where and how they should be used in the temple. Beautifully fits with older civilizations. Vitruvius, the Greeks, were much closer to the ancient Egyptians and Sumerians than what we were. They're part of the same tradition. And Da Vinci and the Renaissance people, they made no secret of it. They actually went to Greece and the other parts of the Mediterranean and studied these places and come back to it, and there we get like our modern weights and measures and proportions, literally from this document. This is one of the smoking guns to find how and why and the methods of how they did these things. Now, you can read further because he talks about how the proportions also lead to systems of weights and measure, also weight as well. Now, paragraph 5, further, it was from the members of the body that we derived the fundamental ideas of the measures which are obviously necessary in all works, as finger, palm, and cubit. These are portioned so as to form the perfect number called in Greek. And as a perfect number, the ancients fixed upon 10, for it is a number of the fingers of the hand that the palm is found, and the foot from the palm. Again, while 10 is naturally perfect, as being made up by the fingers of 2 palms, Plato also held that this number was perfect because 10 is composed of the individual units called by the Greeks. But as soon as 11 or 12 is reached, the numbers being excessive cannot be perfect until they come to 10 for the second time. Nice link in there. It's pointing anyway. The component parts of a number of the individual parts. The mathematician, however, maintaining a different view, have said that the perfect number is 6 because this number is composed of the integral parts which are suited numerically to their method of reckoning. Thus, 1 is 1/6, 2 is 1/3, 3 is 1/2, 4 is 2/3, as they call it, 5s and 5/6, and 6 is a perfect number. Now that leads to music theory. And, well, for instance, the tetractys, the Pythagorean tetractys, or the tetragrammaton in the Kabbalist, the Judeo tradition. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, 1 plus 2 plus 3 equals 6. 1 times 2 times 3 equals 6. 6 is that perfect number. We also get musical proportions, 2 to 3 and 3 to 4. 2 to the third is 8, 3 squared is 9. Now these are also the proportions built into the Parthenon and others, so what we have is a perfect fifth and a perfect fourth. Earlier in Vitruvius, he describes how the fifth and the fourth are essential in temple design, and you also find those proportions in the pyramids, 2 to 3, 3 to 4. They're repeated consistently. It is there all the time. Even between the pyramids are proportioned at it. So the red pyramid is 3 wide, the Great Pyramid is 2 high. Khafre's pyramid is 3 wide to 2 high. It's there, it's repeated all the time. Now, the Greeks and the Romans learnt from earlier civilizations. They describe, again, weights and measure systems being the smoking gun in all of this, and we also have exquisite records, as here in Vitruvius, who not only describes the proportions and the symbols of temple design, he also describes the machines for lifting them. And I must say again, this is not included among certain researchers because it erodes away the foundations of a certain narrative. That's the only way I can say it. It's excluded intentionally. For instance, aqueducts, how they were built, the perfection of their design, not talked about because it's a higher level of accuracy than the pyramids, but because it's so well written, including in Vitruvius, the amount of stone moved to make the aqueducts, again, larger than the pyramids. But let's not talk about that because that's a problem. Now, I'll put the links in these descriptions. Now, why is this important? If we go back to Borobudur and the use of this measure and the proportions and the music theory numbers embedded therein. Well, what we also see, so this was roughly 1,000 years after Greco-Buddhist architecture. Now, what is the Greco-Buddhism? What we see is, especially in places like Bactria and Gandhara, which is present-day Afghanistan and Pakistan, where we see the Greek influence, including, for instance, this column capital as a palmet, and it's ionic. All right. Now, what we also have is, well, countless. We have Greco-Buddhist forms all over the joint, and the influence of Greek sculpture, because the connections over to there. Music theory, Greek musicians at the ceremonies to open certain temples. Buddhas of Bamiyan, which again have this this form of architecture, which is very specific to certain periods of time. And so, well, what do we have? Indian figures carrying the cornucopia. Sirkap Temple, which has Corinthian architecture amongst other classic Greek forms. And also in Gandhara, Bactria, Kushan Empire, what do we have? Corinthian columns, including the acanthus leaf, but with Buddhas in the center. So what we see is this exchange of knowledge back and forth, just as Greek math and geometry seems to have been influenced by Vedic traditions, and Sumerian cross-Vedic to Mohenjo-Daro, these type of places. What we literally, it's there to be seen, and well, just countless forms and the connections between them. What you find is even Atlas holding up the world. You can find this in Gandhara and in Bactria. And nearly time, okay, but this document, Vitruvius, 10 Books of Architecture, it's essential. It really is written down there, not just the why, but also the how, including the machines, but also the astrology, astronomy, the importance and meaning of water, why certain temples have a female as opposed to others have a male aspect, their placement within the city plan, all connected, drawn, the numbers, the systems of measure. It really is all there. This is a smoking gun, but it's just not spoken about. Anyway, have a good one. Hello SGD, Sacred Geometry Decoded, and this will be part 8 in this look at Borobudur and how these temple plans, harmonics, again connect cross time, cross cultures, and we see these influences or synchronicities, however you want to look at it. But what we have is these temples, Buddhist, Hindu, Greek. You can also apply it to cathedrals, major public buildings. For instance, it's well known the geometry of Washington DC, but also in major public buildings within DC, the Supreme Court building, the US Capitol building, and the monuments therein, always at these very special set of numbers and these very special set of proportions. So what you have is the plan, like you have 5 square, let's just call them square levels, and then 3 circular levels, but also so the number of stupas on each of the 3 circular top levels, and then carrying them down. So how does this apply? Well, amongst the other, so more than a few sites, papers, people have studied Borobudur and the math therein, very geometric, very mathematical. It's not just a random setup. But so Pythagorean, Pythagorean theorem, but also the music and what they call Pythagorean hammers. So as the story goes, Pythagoras was walking along and he heard the foundations of music tuning. He heard blacksmith hammers banging, and he rushed inside to understand the proportions between the hammers, and he noticed that the weight of the hammers were in a certain scale, which created these beautiful musical proportions. Now, this music of the hammers, which also applies to bells and strings, has also been something that carries through to the ancient quadrivium and through to the cathedral builders and still with us today. And so that's Pythagorean hammers. Now, this is some screenshots from 10 Books of Architecture by Vitruvius, engineer as well. Volcanoes, you name it, it's in there. But so we have the quadrivium, the four higher of the seven liberal arts: arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. And the concept was that these were unified, that they shouldn't be separated. And for instance, it appears then that Pythagoras made a mistake by not observing that the arts are each composed of two things, the actual and the theory of it. Of those things, the doing of a work is proper to men trained in the individual subject, while the other, the theory, is common to all scholars, for example, to physicians and musicians, the rhythmical beat of a pulse and its metrical movement. But if there is a wound to be healed or a sick man to be saved from danger, the musician will not be called, for the business will be appropriate to the physician. So in the case of a musical instrument, not the physician, but the musician will be the man to tune it, so that the ears may be found to find their due pleasure in its strains. But it's also important to note that at that time, music was also considered a form of healing as well. So that needs to be taken in the broader context. It's a long text, so I can't read all of it, but now, the next part, astronomers likewise have a common ground for discussing with musicians in the harmony of the stars and the musical concords in the tetrads and triads of the fourth and the fifth, with the geometricians in the subject of the vision. Now, let's go back to Pythagoras. So there is geometry in the humming of the strings, there is music in the spacing of the spheres. Now, I could go on about Bode's law and the geometry there, but astronomers likewise have a common ground for discussing with musicians in the harmony of the stars and the musical concords in the tetrads and triads of the fourth and the fifth, with geometricians in the subject of a vision. Now, why that's important, because especially if you read the earlier intro, he says that firstly, the architect must also be an engineer. He must have hands-on experience, but also he must be trained across several disciplines. And for instance, the musician, the astronomer, the geometrician, the mathematician, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. These are all integral parts that go into being a city planner, a temple builder, and connected with these things. Now that goes on to Borobudur. Okay, now I've mentioned that one, which brings us back. So just going to focus on musical concords in tetrads and triads of the fourth and the fifth. It goes like this: the fourth, the fifth. Okay, with geometricians in the subject of vision, geometry, arithmetic, music, and astronomy are all connected, and especially the geometry of music. There's a saying, who was it? I can't remember exactly who said it, but geometry is music frozen, or is it architecture is music frozen in time? All these, you can't really separate, at least in their minds, you can't separate one from the other. To be an engineer, you need to be an architect. To be an architect, you need to be an engineer. To be either one of them, you have to have music, geometry, arithmetic, and astronomy. Now, of course, now engineers and architects, it's essential to have math and geometry, but only certain architects such as I.M. Norman Foster still incorporate astronomy and music in their buildings, and well, we've hidden in plain sight. But anyway, so Pythagorean hammers. Now there's that famous picture of Pythagoras, and there we see the Tetractys, which was the Pythagorean swore on oath on the Tetractys. We've got triangular numbers. There's all sorts of lovely maths going on in there. But so we also have the proportions of these hammers. So when Pythagoras walked into the blacksmith, you notice that one hammer was 12 pounds, another 9, another 8, another 6, and that's what gave him these lovely proportions, because we have a 4 to 3, 3 to 2, 9 to 8, and 2 to 1. So we have the perfect fifth, the perfect fourth, the whole tone, and the octave incorporated in there, and we see this in Borobudur. So now we have these numbers here. Now I've just, on this chart, I've just simplified it, just divide them by half to get the basic proportions. So the top three levels are 4, 3, 2. Okay, there's 432 on the bottom, 5 levels, but 4, 3, 2. And this all links to the vesica, but so 2, 3, 4, 8, 9, 11. Now these are the inherent proportions here: 3 to 2, or 2 to 3. It works as the inverse as well. 3 to 4, 9 to 8, or 8 to 9, and 2 to 1. The octave, the tone, the perfect fourth, and the fifth. tetrads and triads of the fourth and the fifth with the geometry, music, arithmetic, and astronomy. Now this, I could go on to a long list, but for instance, René Descartes, famous for Cartesian coordinates, but also his work on music, and you see these older people were across multiple disciplines, and that was, as they still sort of say, someone who's a Renaissance man is someone who's not just a specialist in one area, has a broad range of knowledge, and you can see that exemplified. It's a Kircher, Descartes, all the alchemists, hermeticists of that period. But it's not just the numbers of the Buddhas, of the statues of the Buddhas in the niches or in the stupa, it's the inherent proportions of the building itself that contains the same information. So as what's been studied, the ratios within the building are 4, 6, and 9, which can be simplified to, so for instance, there we see 2, 3, 9, and 4, 6, 9. Well, these are vesica ratios. They all emerge from the vesica Pisces, is 2 to 3. So 4 to 6 equals 2 to 3. 6 to 9 equals 2 to 3. But more, and you can see just like, the vesica is this spacing. Cross time, cross cultures, you'll see it everywhere. The Parthenon, for instance, 4 to 9, it's 9 to 4. And inside the temple itself, 2 to 3 is repeated throughout Pythagorean triplets are in there as well. The same Pythagorean triplets which you can find in places like Stonehenge, Karnak megaliths in France, sites all across the ancient world. And even 9 to 4, that's 3 squared is 9, 2 squared is 4, and we get that same thing happening here. So Parthenon 9 to 4, but the inherent ratios are 3 to 2. And that same 3 to 2 ratios, I should update these cards because it connects even the pyramid of Menkaure. All the pyramids are joined by here. Now, for instance, the red pyramid is 3 wide, the Great Pyramid is 2 high in proportion, and Khafre's pyramid is 3 wide and 2 high. And you could extend that as well. But so the pyramids of Parthenon, especially in the more modern building connected to, such as a legislative building in Winnipeg, the streets, the street plans by especially this Masonic tradition as well, 2 to 3, and these Buddha statues in there. So 3 to 4, 2 to 3, it's just built in there. So what we have is in Borobudur. Now, speaking of harmonics, so let's go back to Vitruvius, chapter 4, I think it's book 3. But anyway, chapter on harmonics. Harmonics is an obscure and difficult branch of musical science, especially for those who do not know Greek, if we desire to treat of it. So in Vitruvius, he references basically they inherited it from the Greeks, and the Greeks inherited it from Persians, Mesopotamians, and Egyptians. For instance, the Plato talks about Atlantis. That story come through Solon, and Solon learned it through the Greeks. Herodotus and others even visited the pyramids, and what they describe, what was happening. Yeah, well, there are certain. So sometimes it's okay to quote Herodotus when it suits certain narratives, but when it doesn't, then let's pretend it's not. Okay, that's something else. But harmonics. And so again, this is the book of architecture, but he's talking about astronomy, geometry, arithmetic, medicine, water, the machinery of construction. But so again, just about the harmonics and the notes how to design theatres, how to incorporate the right proportions and get the right music happening inside the temples there. So natural laws. Now then, these intervals of tones and semitones of a tetrachord are a division introduced by nature in the case of a voice, and she has defined their limits by measures according to the magnitude of the intervals and determined their characteristics in certain different ways. These natural laws are followed by the skilled workmen who fashion musical instruments in bringing them to the perfection of their proper concords. So again, this is these temples, as above, so below. What they're trying to do is replicate. So famously, Greek temples were built. Man is the measure of all things. The temples were there to incorporate the proportions which define a perfect human form, just like Vitruvius earlier episode, I mentioned Vitruvian Man, Leonardo da Vinci, and so yeah, really is all in there, and it's quite it's very, very important text because again, this can be applied to ancient sites across the world, and the importance of music. And so especially to do with Pythagorean music, it was just, they work, well, you have a string, so the lyre, whether it's in Sumer or whether it's in ancient Egypt, an important instrument. If you halve the string and then halve it again, you have these proportions emerging from there. It doesn't require advanced computers and computation power. It's the laws of nature, and also just like the laws of geometry, they're natural. To halve something, or to draw the vesica, two circles, this symmetry is what nature leads us to. This is, and now it's subjective to some people like that discordant new classical music. I can't bear it. It's like a screaming cat getting her fingernails drawn down a chalkboard. It's just horrible, but each to their own. But for the most part, the golden ratio is a beautiful ratio, and these music proportions are beautiful proportions as a whole. Generally speaking, it doesn't, everyone's got their different. Now, okay, it also talks about sounding vessels in accordance with foregoing investigations of mathematical principles. Let bronze vessels be made proportionate to the size of the theatre, and let them be fashioned that when touched they may produce with one another the notes of the fourth, the fifth, and so on, up to the double octave. So again, this is applying these, to make a beautiful temple. It must all sound good. So just like when you go into if you go into a lovely old cathedral, they were designed in a very specific way to create this resonance. The sound of the building is as important as the beauty of it. It's as important as the proportions of height to width to create a certain feeling, and to make them different from a house, because a house is meant to have a certain feel. A cathedral or a temple or a public building are meant to create a different feeling and change your psychology in there to have a different mindset. You're meant to be relaxed at home. In a temple or a capital building or a cathedral, you're meant to have a different type of mindset, and that's an important theme. And that's why this is an ancient art. This is a way to design perfect cities and design perfect buildings, and music being such an important theme in there. And it's
So there
anyway,
you have it.
have a good one. Links in the
Borobudur
description.
Temple in Indonesia. How these geometric patterns, systems of measurement, symmetry, are not just exclusive to Eastern Hindu and Buddhist traditions, but actually go across time, across the world, and across the globe. And yeah, I think these are very interesting facts because it's these principles are still being employed now by world famous architects. Norman Foster might be one. Recently deceased was I.M. Pei. You'll also find it in major capital cities that were designed off the plan: Washington, Brasilia, Canberra, and Astana. And it is it depends on how you want to approach it and what you want to think about it. But it is undeniable that these patterns are here. How they were transmitted, whether they originated independently in each location or whether they're part of transmitted knowledge, I'll leave that up to you. But yeah, I just wanted to put some of these older videos that were episodic, and rather than a playlist, put them together in a single piece. So hope you enjoyed. SGD signing out.